is using the dog, and the only reaction we've had is to the car in the far corner. And what we have is a reaction from the dog over here, where his head's up in the air, and he's sent in the items that he's trained to find. And when we tie him down, he picks this guy from this door. The important thing to realise is that he's picking the scent that's coming out through the seal of the door. Okay, what we've done is we've deployed the enhanced victim recovery dog into the apartment, and by experience and the training of the dog, what I've first noticed is that as soon as I came in, that the dog's very excited, and as a handler I can pick up his body language, etc. And it would appear to me that as soon as he's come in the house, he's picked up a scent that he recognises. The second dog that we've seen work today is the crime-killing dog, Keela. She will only indicate to me when she's found human blood.
What if the loudest cry for justice in the Madeleine McCann case didn't come from politicians, journalists, or detectives, but from two dogs? In the summer of 2007, Eddie and Keela, world-class forensic dogs trained to detect human blood and the scent of death, barked only at one family's belongings, the McCanns. Behind a sofa, inside a wardrobe, in the boot of their rental car, each alert was chilling, pointing to the same truth. Yet when their handler, Martin Grime, delivered his findings, the parents did not thank him. They dismissed the dogs as unreliable, casting doubt on the very animals that had never lied. If the dogs were right, then everything we've been told for 18 years has been wrong. Can justice be drowned out by denial? That single question captures the heart of the Madeleine McCann case, a case where hard evidence was presented, yet aggressively rejected. On the night of May 3, 2007, in the seaside resort of Praia da Luz, Portugal, 3-year-old Madeleine Beth McCann vanished from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club complex. Her parents, Jerry and Kate McCann, were dining at a tapas bar with friends just 55 meters away. When Kate returned shortly after 10 p.m., the little girl was gone. The window was open, the shutter raised, and the stage was set for what would become the most infamous missing child case of the 21st century. The media storm was immediate and ferocious. Within days, Madeleine's face was on every front page across Europe. British tabloids called it the abduction that shocked the world. Politicians weighed in, celebrities pledged support, and a multi-million-pound fund was established to find Madeleine. The official narrative, pushed hard from the very beginning, was simple. An intruder had broken into the apartment and stolen the child. But behind the headlines, detectives struggled. There were no signs of forced entry despite early claims of a broken shutter. No fingerprints from a stranger were found. Witness timelines conflicted. Some neighbors reported hearing nothing. Others described children crying in the days before, suggesting neglect. Within weeks, the abduction theory looked less like fact and more like assumption. By July, the Portuguese police faced mounting international pressure, but little actual progress. It was in this climate of failure and desperation that authorities called in help from Britain. Not more detectives, not more PR experts, but something far more primitive and far more precise: dogs. Enter Martin Grime, a veteran police handler from South Yorkshire with over 35 years of experience, respected worldwide for his pioneering work in forensic canine units. Alongside him came 2 English Springer Spaniels, whose reputations were already legendary in law enforcement. Eddie, an enhanced victim recovery dog, trained specifically to detect the scent of human cadavers. His alerts had solved murders, found hidden corpses, and even uncovered evidence long after death. Keela, a crime scene investigation dog, specialized in detecting human blood, even microscopic traces invisible to the eye and resistant to cleaning. She could indicate blood decades old, even if it had been washed repeatedly. Together, this trio formed what was often described in police circles as a truth machine. They did not care about narratives, politics, or reputation. They responded only to biological fact, the smell of death and blood. Their track record was near flawless. Eddie and Keela had assisted in hundreds of cases across the UK and the US, with no recorded false positives under Grimes' leadership. The FBI themselves consulted with Grimes. When these dogs barked, police listened. In late July 2007, the team was flown into Portugal. The search was filmed, documented, and controlled. Their task, to sweep through key locations in Praia da Luz and test whether any trace of death or blood lingered in the places tied to the McCann case. What followed was nothing short of explosive. Inside apartment 5A, Eddie barked, his unmistakable signal for cadaver scent, behind the sofa, near a wardrobe in the parents' bedroom, and on the veranda. Keela separately indicated traces of human blood on the very same spot behind the sofa. The alerts were not random. They converged. When moved to the McCann's temporary villa, Eddie alerted to items of clothing belonging to Kate McCann and to Madeleine's pink soft toy, Cuddle Cat. Keela did not indicate blood here, but Eddie's cadaver alerts were consistent. Finally, the dogs were tested on vehicles. Out of 10 cars lined up, only one drew a reaction, the Renault Scenic rented by the McCanns 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. Eddie signaled cadaver scent inside the boot and at the driver's door. Keela signaled human blood on the car key and in the boot lining. Forensic testing would later recover 15 of 19 DNA markers consistent with Madeleine from that same boot. These were not vague impressions. They were hard, specific alerts, recorded on video, delivered by dogs with a reputation for reliability. To many observers, the conclusion was obvious: the dogs had spoken the truth. They had found what human investigators had missed. But here lies the conflict that defines this story. Instead of embracing these findings, the McCanns attacked them. Jerry McCann publicly dismissed cadaver dogs as notoriously unreliable, citing a case in the United States where such evidence had been challenged. In one interview, when pressed about Eddie's alerts, he scoffed, "Ask the dogs." Sandra, Kate McCann, in her 2011 memoir Madeleine, mocked the very idea that dogs could detect the scent of death months later, writing, "Did they really believe a dog could smell death 3 months on? They were adding 2 and 2 together and making 10. The clash was stark. On one side, a handler with decades of expertise, backed by animals whose work had been trusted by courts, police, and the FBI. On the other, parents desperate to preserve the narrative of abduction, dismissing the only evidence that pointed to another truth. This is the central tension we must confront. Truth was spoken, but it was silenced. Martin Grimes and his dogs, Eddie and Keela, delivered results that should have reshaped the investigation. Instead, their findings were buried under denial, ridicule, and the weight of a carefully controlled public narrative. 18 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. But in the court of public opinion, the question endures: if the dogs were right, and their record suggests they were, then the world has been missiled from the very beginning. Can justice be drowned out by denial? In the story of Madeleine McCann, the answer seems tragically clear. When the Portuguese police invited a foreign expert to Praia da Luz in the summer of 2007, they did not call a journalist, a politician, or a spin doctor. They called Martin Grimes, a man with no stake in public narratives, no interest in politics, and no loyalty to anyone except the truth as revealed through his dogs. Grimes' career was built on trust and precision. A former senior officer in the South Yorkshire Police Dog Unit, he had more than 35 years of experience in canine training and deployment. Over that time, he had become one of Britain's foremost authorities in forensic dog work, so respected that even the FBI in the United States sought his expertise. He advised them on the use of cadaver and blood dogs in major homicide cases, developing methods that would later become international standards. By the time he arrived in Portugal, Grimes' reputation preceded him. His dogs, Eddie and Keela, had been deployed in over 200 cases across multiple countries. Not one of those deployments recorded a false positive. Courts had accepted their alerts. Murderers had been convicted because of them. Families had been given closure when their missing loved ones were found. In a field where precision meant the difference between justice and failure, Martin Grimes' team was seen as the gold standard. But what made Grime truly different was not just his experience or his results. It was his philosophy of the work. He understood something many outsiders did not. Dogs do not judge. Dogs do not theorize. Dogs do not fabricate. They react to biological facts. They are incapable of malice, incapable of cover-up, incapable of lying. In his own words, the dog is, or instrument of forensic detection, a living tool. When Eddie barked or Keela pointed, it was not a guess or a bias. It was the equivalent of a fingerprint appearing under fluorescent light. Grime carried this philosophy into every investigation. He emphasized, again and again, that his dogs were indicators, not prosecutors. Their alerts were not the end of the process, but the beginning. Every bark, every signal, was a lead that had to be confirmed by laboratory analysis, DNA testing, or corroborating evidence. He was meticulous in separating detection from interpretation. In fact, his official report from Portugal included repeated cautions. The dogs had indicated specific areas and objects, but it was the job of forensic science to provide confirmation. That caution, far from weakening his credibility, made it stronger. Grime never oversold what his dogs had found. He did not grandstand for cameras. He did not speculate about guilt or innocence. He wrote what the animals had done, nothing more, nothing less. That restraint revealed both his professionalism and his integrity. He was not there to accuse the McCanns or anyone else. He was there to let the dogs speak, and then to pass their message on to investigators. And what was that message? It was blunt, consistent, and chilling. All alerts focused exclusively on locations and belongings tied to the McCann family. Behind the sofa in apartment 5A, inside the wardrobe in the parents' bedroom, on Kate McCann's clothing, on Madeleine's favorite toy, Cuddle Cat, in the boot of the Renault Scenic rented by the McCanns, on the key to that same vehicle. Every signal, every reaction, clustered around the family who claimed their daughter had been abducted. None of the surrounding apartments, none of the other cars tested, and none of the homes of other suspects produced alerts. The pattern was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. The dogs were speaking clearly, and Martin Grime, as their handler, became their translator. In his report, he laid out the evidence step by step. He described how Eddie, the cadaver dog, barked behind the sofa in apartment 5A and then again in the wardrobe. He explained how Keela, the blood dog, confirmed traces of human blood in the very same spot behind the sofa. He documented Eddie's alerts at the McCann's villa, and both dogs' alerts on the Renault Scenic. And crucially, he noted that the dogs did not alert anywhere else. This was not scattershot. It was targeted, and it all pointed in one direction. Still, Grime was careful. He never wrote, "The McCanns killed their daughter." He never claimed the alerts proved murder. Instead, he reiterated that the dogs' findings were an investigative tool, a guide for where to look and what to test. He knew the weight of his words. He knew that dog alerts alone would not convict anyone in court. But he also knew what they meant in practical terms. Something deeply troubling was connected to the McCann's property. This professional restraint is precisely why his testimony remains powerful today. Unlike the McCanns, who shifted their accounts, altered their statements, and dismissed evidence outright, Martin Grimes' position never wavered. He presented the alerts exactly as they occurred. He highlighted their consistency. He acknowledged the need for further forensic confirmation, and he left the interpretation to others. That clarity is why many observers now describe Grime as the interpreter of truth. Eddie and Keela could not speak English or Portuguese. They could only bark, sit, or signal. Without Grime, their testimony would have been meaningless. With him, it became a report that entered the official Portuguese police files, a record that could not simply be erased. He gave voice to the voiceless. And yet, instead of gratitude, he and his dogs faced dismissal. Jerry and Kate McCann went on television to mock the very findings he had so carefully documented. They argued the dogs were unreliable, that cadaver scent could not linger, that the alerts meant nothing. In essence, they accused Grime, not directly, but by implication, of presenting flawed or misleading work. For a man who had dedicated his life to uncovering truth through science and discipline, it was an extraordinary insult. But Martin Grime never retaliated with anger. He did not go to the press to defend himself with flashy statements. He did not lash out. He let the record speak. He let Eddie and Keela's history, hundreds of cases, 0 false positives, stand as their defense. And he let his own philosophy remain unshaken. The dogs had done their job. They had told the truth. Whether people chose to hear it was another matter. The importance of Grime's role cannot be overstated. Without him, the alerts might have been dismissed as random behavior. Without his professional credibility, critics could have more easily ignored the dogs. But because it was Martin Grime, respected handler, FBI consultant, 35-year veteran, the alerts carried weight. They became part of the permanent case file. They became the evidence that, even 18 years later, continues to haunt the McCanns. In the story of Madeleine McCann, Martin Grime is not just a side character. He is the translator of an inconvenient truth. A man who, through his dogs, revealed something that powerful voices did not want revealed. He stood calmly, professionally, and firmly in the middle of a storm of denial, holding up a simple, unshakable fact: his dogs had found something, and that something was tied only to the McCanns. In a case clouded by shifting statements, political interference, and media spin, Martin Grime's words remain a rare anchor. He did not speculate. He did not embellish. He did not accuse. He simply spoke for his dogs, and through him, the dogs spoke for Madeleine. Among the 2 dogs brought to Praia da Luz in 2007, none drew more attention than Eddie, an enhanced victim recovery dog whose only task was to detect the scent of human cadavers. At the time, Eddie was 7 years old and already regarded as one of the most accurate tools in modern forensic investigation. Eddie's training was rigorous and specialized. From the earliest stages, Eddie was conditioned to recognize cadaverin and other compounds released during human decomposition. Unlike ordinary sniffer dogs, Eddie was not distracted by food, by the scent of other animals, or by background noise. Training included exposure to real human remains, arranged in cooperation with the FBI in the United States, to ensure that Eddie's alerts were tied exclusively to human death. The cadaver dog could identify scent in soil, in vehicles, on clothing, or even clinging to items that had been washed or burned. For investigators, Eddie represented a living, breathing instrument capable of detecting what no human eye could see. The record spoke for itself. Before being flown to Portugal, Eddie had already contributed to dozens of homicide cases in the United Kingdom and abroad. Alerts from Eddie had led to the discovery of hidden graves, decomposed bodies submerged in water, and traces of murder scenes that had been scrubbed clean. In all deployments under handler Martin Grime, there were no false positives recorded. Courts had admitted Eddie's work as part of investigations, and police units across continents had come to trust the cadaver dog as a reliable source of direction in otherwise stalled cases. When Eddie entered apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort, the response was immediate and devastating. In the living room, Eddie barked behind the sofa, a definitive signal that cadaver scent was present. This was not hesitation or curiosity. It was the precise alert drilled into Eddie during years of training. Later, forensic blood dog Keela would indicate the same location, strengthening the significance of the alert. Moving into the parents' bedroom, Eddie gave another alert, this time at the wardrobe. Again, the bark confirmed the presence of scent molecules associated with human decomposition. No other wardrobe, no other furniture in surrounding apartments triggered the same reaction. Outside, on the veranda near the McCann's apartment, Eddie signaled once more. The pattern was consistent. The scent of death was not isolated to a single corner. The most shocking moment came days later, during the search of vehicles. 10 cars were lined up for testing, including those belonging to locals, friends, and other suspects. Eddie inspected each one. 9 cars produced nothing. Then came the Renault Scenic, the vehicle hired by the McCanns nearly 4 weeks after Madeleine vanished. Inside the boot and near the driver's door, Eddie gave an unmistakable bark. Cadaver scent was present in that car. Keela reinforced this finding by detecting human blood on the key and inside the boot lining. DNA testing would later recover 15 of 19 markers consistent with Madeleine McCann from that same location. What mattered most was not just where Eddie alerted, but where Eddie did not. The cadaver dog walked through apartments 5B, 5D, 5H, and even the home of Robert Murat, a man once considered a prime suspect. Eddie found nothing in any of these places. The alerts occurred only in spaces directly tied to the McCanns, apartment 5EA, their rented villa, and their Renault Scenic. For seasoned investigators, this was a devastating pattern. For Eddie, it was simply the performance of duty. Cadaver scent was present, and Eddie indicated it with the same precision that had cracked homicide cases before. Public reaction to Eddie's work was sharp and divided. Supporters saw the dog as a truth teller, incapable of bias or deception. On forums, in documentaries, and across social media, one phrase began to circulate: dogs don't lie. Eddie's alerts were seen as pure fact, molecules detected by a nose so finely tuned that no human denial could erase them. Critics of the McCanns argued that no parent could simply explain away a cadaver dog's bark. As one commentator wrote, "You can argue with people, but you cannot argue with chemistry." The McCanns, however, tried. They dismissed the alerts as unreliable. Jerry McCann cited supposed cases in America where cadaver dogs had been challenged in court. Kate McCann suggested that scent might have transferred from her medical work or from trash carried in the car. Yet none of these explanations addressed the most damning question: if Eddie's alerts were meaningless, why did they occur nowhere else? Why not in other apartments? Why not in other cars? Why only theirs? The reality is that Eddie behaved in Praia da Luz exactly as trained and exactly as expected. Eddie detected cadaver scent where it existed and ignored all other spaces. The alerts were consistent, specific, and unambiguous. In the story of Madeleine McCann, Eddie's bark has become a symbol. It is the sound of truth cutting through layers of denial, politics, and public relations. It is the voice of a creature incapable of lies, pointing investigators toward the darkest possibility. And that is why, even today, many people who study the case return to the same conclusion, whatever else may be debated. Eddie's alerts remain the single most honest testimony ever given in the search for Madeleine. If Eddie was the dog that spoke of death, Keela was the one that spoke of blood. At just 3 years old in 2007, Keela was already recognized as one of the most skilled crime scene investigation dogs in Britain. While Eddie specialized in cadaver scent, Keela's training focused with surgical precision on the detection of human blood. From the very beginning, Keela's education was unique. Unlike dogs trained broadly on scent, Keela was conditioned exclusively with human blood samples. These samples came from a wide variety of sources, different ages, sexes, and ethnic backgrounds, screened in controlled conditions by the Northern General Hospital in Sheffield. The purpose was clear: Keela had to be able to detect blood under any circumstance, from any person, no matter how old the trace might be. Her training pushed boundaries. Keela was exposed to blood that had dried for years, blood that had been washed out multiple times, and blood hidden among overwhelming contaminations, such as rotting fish or garbage. By the time Keela began working in active cases, the blood dog could identify a single trace in a sea of hundreds of controls. In one early deployment, Keela detected a faint smear of blood on a fishing boat saturated with the stench of decomposed fish. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood was primate, likely human. That was the level of precision investigators trusted. So when Keela arrived in Praia da Luz, expectations were high. If blood had ever been present in apartment 5A or in the McCanns' belongings, Keela would find it. The search began inside the apartment. Behind the sofa, where Eddie had already barked to indicate cadaver scent, Keela pointed to microscopic traces of human blood. The location matched perfectly, a double confirmation. The cadaver dog had smelled death, and the blood dog had found the chemical residue left behind. Later testing confirmed the presence of blood too small for the naked eye to see. But the most devastating revelations came not in the apartment, but with the McCanns' Renault Scenic. When the dogs were taken to examine the vehicles, Keela's behavior was as clinical as always. Car after car, nothing. Until she reached the Scenic. There Keela indicated twice, once on the car key itself, and again inside the boot. These were not guesses or curiosities. They were precise alerts drilled into her from years of training. The presence of blood in the very same location where Eddie had barked cadaver scent was an undeniable convergence. For investigators, this was a powerful chain. Eddie had signaled death. Keela had signaled blood. Both dogs pointed at the same key areas, behind the sofa, inside the car, on items belonging to the McCanns. The conclusion was unavoidable. Something human, something violent, had occurred in those spaces. What made Keela's alerts even more damning was her ability to detect blood that had been cleaned, laundered, or aged. Unlike standard forensic tests, which often fail when samples are too diluted or degraded, Keela's nose could identify chemical traces years later. That meant someone could wash a floor a dozen times, run clothing through a machine, or scrub a car interior, and Keela could still signal that blood had once been there. In Praia da Luz, her alerts implied that efforts, perhaps deliberate, had been made to erase what had happened. Public reaction to Keela's findings mirrored the shock that followed Eddie's alerts. If Eddie spoke of a corpse, Keela confirmed the story with blood. Commentators online framed it simply: bodies may vanish. Stories may change, but blood doesn't lie, and neither does a dog trained to find it. Supporters of the McCanns tried to dismiss Keela's signals. They argued the blood might have belonged to another person, or that traces could have been transferred innocently. Yet the specificity of the locations, and the fact that no other apartment or car produced alerts, undermined those defenses. Why would blood appear behind that particular sofa? Why on that particular car key? Why in that specific boot, weeks after Madeleine's disappearance? There were no satisfactory answers. For those following the case, Keela's work became symbolic. Where Eddie shouted, Keela whispered, pointing with quiet certainty to stains invisible to the eye. Together, the dogs told a single story: death and blood were present where they should not have been. In the broader narrative, Keela's alerts carried heavy meaning. They corroborated Eddie's bark, transforming a cadaver scent into a layered forensic picture. Without Keela, critics might have dismissed Eddie's alerts as abstract. With Keela, the case acquired chemical weight. The dogs were not random. They were not confused. They were consistent, precise, and mutually reinforcing. And that is why, nearly 2 decades later, people still repeat the phrase born from her alerts: blood doesn't lie. And neither does Keela. From July 30 to August 7, 2007, the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann moved into its most revealing stage. After months of confusion, conflicting timelines, and political pressure, the deployment of Eddie and Keela began to produce results that no witness statement or theory could deliver. Over just 8 days, the 2 dogs created a pattern so precise that even the most skeptical investigator could not ignore it. The search started in apartment 5A, the very place Madeleine was last seen alive. Almost immediately, the cadaver dog Eddie gave a strong bark behind the sofa. This was the trained signal, one that had been repeated countless times in homicide investigations, that the unmistakable scent of human cadaver was present. Keela later confirmed this by indicating microscopic traces of human blood in the same spot, an extraordinary convergence between 2 different detection methods. Eddie alerted again in the parents' bedroom, this time inside the wardrobe. No other furniture in any other apartment produced a reaction. Even outside on the veranda, Eddie gave another signal. The meaning was clear. In multiple places within apartment 5A, the scent of death and traces of blood lingered. Attention then turned to the villa where the McCanns had moved after leaving apartment 5A. Here, Eddie's nose found more. The cadaver dog reacted to items of clothing belonging to Kate McCann, including a pair of checked trousers and a sleeveless white top. Eddie also alerted on Madeleine's soft toy, the pink cuddle cat, which had been washed repeatedly but still carried the chemical traces associated with decomposition. Keela did not react here, but the alerts by Eddie alone were disturbing. How could the scent of cadaver attach itself to Kate's clothing and to Madeleine's favorite toy? The answers offered later, medical work, accidental transfer, failed to explain why none of the other apartments or possessions in Praia da Luz carried the same scent. By the end of the search period, Martin Grime compiled his report. It told a story more coherent than months of speculation. Apartment 5A contained both cadaver scent and blood. The villa contained cadaver scent on Kate's clothing and on Madeleine's toy. The Renault Scenic contained both cadaver scent and blood, with partial DNA linking to Madeleine. Nowhere else in Praia da Luz produced alerts. The convergence was absolute. All signals pointed back to the same family. Grime, cautious as ever, emphasized that dog alerts required forensic confirmation. He reminded investigators that the dogs were indicators, not evidence in themselves. But the clustering of alerts into McCann-related spaces was undeniable. For a handler with more than 200 successful deployments, the consistency was striking. In his words, the dogs had done their job. They had spoken through scent, and he had faithfully recorded their message. The implications were enormous. The official narrative of abduction, already weak, now stood in direct opposition to biological signals left behind in the McCann's own environment. For many observers, the truth was no longer buried in theories but laid out in stark detail. Cadaver scent and blood had been present in places connected only to the McCanns. The dogs did not know whose clothes they sniffed, whose car they entered, or whose sofa they examined. They responded to chemistry, not to politics or reputation. And the chemistry told a story the public was never meant to hear. Eddie and Keela did not find anything in Murat's home, or in the apartments of neighbors, or in the cars of friends. They found it in the McCann's apartment, their villa, and their car. In that silence elsewhere, and in those sharp, consistent alerts, the objective truth emerged. Whatever explanations would later be offered, whatever denials would be made, the message of that week remained clear. The trail of scent and blood did not scatter across Praia da Luz. It led in one direction only, back to the McCanns. When the alerts from Eddie and Keela began to circulate within the investigation, a natural expectation followed, that the parents of a missing child would treat every piece of evidence, however painful, with gravity. Instead, what emerged from Jerry and Kate McCann was a systematic campaign of denial, dismissal, and linguistic deflection. From the very beginning, Jerry attacked the credibility of the dogs. In interviews broadcast in Portugal and later in Britain, he described cadaver dogs as extremely unreliable, often repeating this phrase until it stuck in headlines. When pressed by Portuguese journalist Sandra Felgueiras in November 2009, Jerry gave one of his most infamous lines. Asked directly about the cadaver scent alerts, he replied with a smirk, "Ask the dogs, Sandra." The statement, intended to trivialize the evidence, instead crystallized the couple's approach. Rather than engage with the findings, Jerry mocked the very idea that they were worth discussing. To strengthen this stance, Jerry reached for examples from outside Portugal. He frequently cited the Eugene Zapata case in the United States, where cadaver dogs had reportedly given false alerts during a missing person investigation. What Jerry did not clarify was that the Zapata case involved dogs with a less rigorous training record, that the alerts were not properly corroborated by handlers, and that Zapata himself ultimately confessed to murder years later. In other words, the case did not exonerate cadaver dogs, but rather highlighted the difficulty of securing convictions when prosecutors fail to support canine evidence with forensic confirmation. By invoking Zapata, Jerry used a partial truth to construct a misleading picture, suggesting that Eddie and Keela's alerts were just another example of canine fallibility. Kate's strategy was subtler, but no less dismissive. In her 2011 memoir, Madeleine, she devoted multiple passages to ridiculing the notion that dogs could detect scent months after a death. She wrote with exasperation, "Did they really believe a dog could smell death 3 months on? They were adding 2 and 2 together and making 10. The line was memorable, but misleading. Research in forensic science had already established that cadaverine and other decomposition compounds can persist for months, or even years in enclosed environments." By mocking the idea, Kate transformed established forensic principles into something that sounded ridiculous to the average reader. Kate also offered personal explanations that blurred the boundary between the plausible and the absurd. She suggested that cadaver scent on her clothing could have come from her medical work as a general practitioner in the months before the holiday. According to her, she had been in contact with 6 deceased patients in the 6 months prior to May 2007. Somehow, she argued, those encounters might have transferred cadaver scent onto her clothes, which she then brought to Portugal. The problem with this claim was not only its improbability, but its selectivity. Why would the scent cling to only 2 specific garments? Why would it resurface on a child's toy? Why did no other doctor's wardrobe provoke alerts from Eddie? Instead of resolving the issue, the explanation raised further questions. The couple's defense extended to the Renault Scenic, the car they hired weeks after Madeleine's disappearance. Here, the explanations reached almost comic levels of variety. At different points, representatives for the McCanns suggested that the smell detected by Eddie could have come from discarded diapers, from spoiled meat or fish transported in the vehicle, or from general household waste. Each suggestion was designed not to convince with clarity, but to sow doubt. If enough maybes existed, perhaps the public would stop focusing on the one undeniable fact: both dogs had reacted specifically to that car, and DNA markers consistent with Madeleine had been recovered from the boot. Taken together, these strategies formed a deliberate linguistic wall of denial. By calling the dogs unreliable, Jerry reframed the evidence as anecdote. By citing Zapata, he gave the impression that canine alerts had been discredited globally. By mocking the science of scent, Kate invited the public to laugh at investigators rather than scrutinize them. By offering a carousel of alternative explanations, cadavers at work, dirty diapers, rotting meat, the couple generated a fog thick enough to obscure the simple clarity of the alerts. This was not the pursuit of truth. This was the construction of plausible escape routes. Each word, each quip, each explanation served to transform objective indications into subjective illusions. The dogs had not found cadaver scent and blood. The McCanns implied they had simply been mistaken, or contaminated, or confused by everyday life. In effect, the couple attempted to turn the most objective evidence in the case into what one journalist later called a mirage, evaporating as soon as you tried to look directly at it. The significance of this denial cannot be overstated. For investigators, it made progress nearly impossible. Any attempt to confront the McCanns with the alerts was met not with reflection, but with rehearsed counter-arguments. For the public, the denial sowed division. Supporters of the couple seized on phrases like, "ask the dogs," or 2 and 2 equals 10, as proof that canine evidence was a joke. Critics, meanwhile, saw the very act of dismissal as suspicious. Why would innocent parents attack the most advanced tools available to help find their child? In the years that followed, this wall of denial became the defining feature of the McCanns' public posture. They never accepted the possibility that the dogs were correct. They never acknowledged the consistency of the alerts across apartment, villa, and car. Instead, they built a fortress of words, mockery, half-truths, and redirections that shielded them from the most damning evidence in the case. Ultimately, the meaning is stark. The denials were not about clarifying facts, they were about controlling the narrative. By attacking the dogs, the McCanns neutralized the single line of evidence that pointed unambiguously back to them. By mocking the science, they kept the focus on theory rather than chemistry. And by flooding the public with alternative explanations, they transformed the clarity of a bark and a point into the ambiguity of endless debate. In doing so, they achieved their goal. By 2008, the Portuguese authorities closed the case, citing lack of conclusive evidence. The alerts remained in the files, but buried under layers of denial. The dogs had spoken, but their testimony was drowned out. And so the central conflict of this case remains. 2 dogs indicated death and blood where none should have been. Their handler recorded it with precision. Yet the parents of the missing child built a wall of words so high that the truth could not climb over it. This was not a quest for justice. It was a performance of survival. When Eddie barked behind the sofa and Keela pointed to blood in the same spot, a chain reaction began. Forensic evidence that should have reoriented the investigation was instead buried beneath layers of denial. Yet suppression did not erase the alerts. Instead, it fueled the imagination of investigators, journalists, and the public, who began constructing theories to explain what the dogs had uncovered. These theories diverged in detail, but converged on one essential point. If the dogs were right, then the official abduction narrative was false. The first and most widely circulated theory was that Madeleine died as the result of a domestic accident or overdose. Rumors circulated that Madeleine had been given medication such as Calpol Night to keep her asleep, and that an accidental overdose proved fatal. Another variation suggested that she awoke in the dark, disoriented, and suffered a fall, perhaps from the sofa where Eddie later barked cadaver scent. In either version, the death was not premeditated murder but a tragic accident. What made the theory compelling was how neatly it aligned with the alerts: cadaver scent and blood behind the sofa, wardrobe alerts suggesting temporary concealment, and later signals in the boot of the car implying disposal. According to this line of thought, when the accident occurred, panic took over. Rather than call authorities, the parents staged an abduction, opening a window and raising a shutter to create the illusion of intrusion. The now infamous cry, "They've taken her," was not a statement of fact but of strategy. The second major theory expanded the circle of complicity to include the Tapas 7, the friends dining with the McCanns that night. Supporters of this idea point to the tangled web of contradictions in their witness statements. Some claim to have seen Jerry checking on the children at times that others contradicted. Descriptions of whether doors were locked or unlocked shifted over interviews. One friend described curtains, whooshing, in a dramatic fashion that investigators later said could not have happened. Critics argue these inconsistencies were not innocent memory lapses, but deliberate attempts to synchronize a cover story. By this reasoning, the Tapas 7 had every incentive to protect the McCanns, because each of them had also left their own children alone that night. If Madeleine's death exposed not only negligence but potentially criminal neglect, all could be implicated. Thus, a pact of silence was formed. The dogs' alerts fit seamlessly here. Their signals forced attention back to apartment 5A, but the collective testimony of friends worked to push suspicion outward, toward phantom abductors and away from the group. The third theory ventured into darker territory: political intervention at the highest levels of the British government. From the early days, critics noted how unusual it was that senior diplomats, media advisors, and even prime ministers appeared so invested in one family's tragedy. The British ambassador arrived on the scene within hours. Downing Street issued statements of support. Funding for investigations continued long after similar cases would have been abandoned. According to this theory, the McCanns, both physicians with connections in elite circles, were protected not only for personal reasons but for political ones. An international scandal involving British citizens neglecting or even harming their child while abroad risked damaging relations with Portugal and the European Union. By framing the disappearance strictly as abduction, the government shielded its citizens from blame and preserved diplomatic appearances. In this version, Operation Grange, the costly British review of the case, was less an investigation than a public relations operation designed to avoid confronting the alerts of Eddie and Keela. The fourth theory dealt with the question that haunts every discussion: where is the body? For many, the absence of Madeleine's remains was the strongest card in the McCanns' defense. Yet theorists drew on the dogs' alerts to propose explanations. One idea was that her body was temporarily concealed in apartment of 5A, the wardrobe, the flower bed outside, before being transferred in the Renault Scenic weeks later. The alerts in the car boot and on the key suggested that human remains, however briefly, had been inside. From there, possibilities expanded: disposal at sea, burial in the Portuguese countryside, or incineration. Jerry's known fondness for golf near coastal areas added fuel to theories of ocean disposal. The very lack of a body became, paradoxically, proof of deliberate concealment. Supporters of this theory note that Eddie and Keela's alerts do not require a body to remain in place. They testify that a body had once been there. What unites all of these theories: accident, collective cover-up, political intervention, and disposal, is their origin point in the alerts of the dogs. Without Eddie and Keela, these possibilities might have remained fringe speculation. With them, they gained traction. Cadaver scent behind the sofa is not rumor. Blood traces on a car key are not gossip. DNA markers in a boot are not tabloid fantasy. These are hard signals, and they demanded explanation. Because the official narrative refused to provide one, the public supplied its own. For the online communities, this dynamic carried deep symbolic weight. If the dogs had been believed, the investigation might have pursued these leads with rigor. But because the alerts were dismissed, the theories lived outside official channels, circulating in forums, books, and documentaries. In this way, denial did not kill the truth, it multiplied it. By rejecting the dogs, Jerry and Kate inadvertently seeded a forest of speculation. Critics of the McCanns see this as poetic justice. Every time the couple denied, mocked, or explained away the dogs, they strengthened the sense that something was hidden. And every theory that emerged served as a reminder of what had been ignored. For supporters of the family, these theories are baseless slander, harmful distractions from the search for a living child. But even they cannot fully explain away why the only consistent biological evidence in the case pointed inward, not outward. In the end, these theories represent not wild imagination, but the vacuum left by suppression. When the clearest forensic signals of the case are dismissed, people will inevitably construct explanations to fill the gap. And whether those explanations involve sedatives, group conspiracies, political cover-ups, or secret disposals, they all trace back to the same origin, the bark of Eddie and the point of Keela. This is why, 18 years later, the case refuses to fade. Theories live on because the evidence that inspired them was never properly confronted. And for the public, the meaning is simple. The dogs uncovered the root of the truth, even if that truth was officially denied. When Eddie and Keela finished their work in Praia da Luz, the expectation among many observers was that their alerts would shift the investigation into new territory. Cadaver scent behind the sofa, blood on the car key, DNA markers in the boot of the Renault Scenic, these were the kinds of signals that normally recalibrated an inquiry. Yet what followed was not renewed focus on the McCanns, but a counteroffensive through the press. From September 2007 onward, Jerry and Kate McCann, supported by a network of PR advisors, lawyers, and sympathetic journalists, began a campaign to dismantle the credibility of the dogs and their handler. Instead of treating Eddie and Keela as valuable tools, they were recast as troublemakers, obstacles that muddied the case rather than clarified it. In interviews, Jerry repeated his mantra: the dogs were notoriously unreliable. In press briefings, allies described the alerts as meaningless without full DNA proof. Newspaper headlines in Britain echoed these talking points, portraying the Portuguese investigation as incompetent and the dogs as a curious but ultimately flawed experiment. Caught in this storm was Martin Grime, a man who had simply followed procedure. He had not accused the McCanns. He had not speculated about guilt. His reports had been careful, even restrained, emphasizing that the dogs' alerts were investigative leads requiring forensic confirmation. But in the court of public opinion, nuance did not matter. Because his work had pointed in a direction uncomfortable for the McCanns, Grime found himself framed as a source of noise. The attacks were subtle at first. British media, influenced by the McCanns' PR machine, ran features about cases where cadaver dogs had been challenged. The implication was clear. Grime's dogs were part of a long history of unreliable evidence. Soon, the tone hardened. Columnists questioned whether the dogs were sniffing ghosts. Radio presenters mocked the idea of scent lasting months. By extension, Grime himself became suspect, a professional whose supposedly elite tools were now being ridiculed in public. The pressure was not confined to the press. Behind the scenes, Jerry contacted senior figures in British policing to question the validity of the canine unit. Emails later released show attempts to lobby against the weight given to the alerts. The strategy was deliberate. If the dogs could be discredited, then the narrative they produced could be neutralized. And if the narrative was neutralized, the McCanns could present themselves once again as victims of a botched foreign investigation. For Grime, the effect was corrosive. After 35 years of service, he was suddenly painted as the man who had introduced unreliable evidence into one of the most high-profile cases in the world. His reputation, once an asset to international law enforcement, now felt precarious. Colleagues continued to respect him, but the wider public, fed a steady diet of dismissive sound bites, was being conditioned to see him as fallible. Eventually, the pressure forced Grime to respond. In statements and interviews, he clarified his position. The dogs had done their job exactly as trained, but alerts were indicators, not conclusions. The irony was stark. In any other investigation, a handler like Grime would have been celebrated. His dogs had solved murders, found hidden graves, and given closure to families. They were respected by the FBI and accepted by courts. But in Praia da Luz, the very consistency of their alerts made them enemies of the official narrative. The McCanns needed to protect the abduction story, and so the dogs became dangerous. By extension, their handler became a target. The deeper tragedy was symbolic. Eddie and Keela, described by Grime as living forensic tools, had no voice beyond their trained reactions. They could not defend themselves against accusations of unreliability. They could not explain why they barked in one place and not another. They could only do their job. And yet, in the aftermath, they were treated not as neutral instruments, but as flawed witnesses whose testimony was inconvenient. The silent truth-tellers became the villains. For many in the public, this reversal was incomprehensible. Online forums filled with posts defending the dogs. "They can't lie," wrote one user. "They have no agenda." Others accused the McCanns of smearing not just investigators but innocent animals, whose only mistake was finding what should not have been found. The spectacle of parents undermining dogs hired to help find their daughter struck many as grotesque. Instead of gratitude, there was hostility. Instead of cooperation, there was rejection. This is the essence of the biographical tragedy that befell Grime and his dogs. They represented truth stripped of politics, truth that did not care for reputation. Yet precisely because they embodied that purity, they became dangerous to those who needed ambiguity. The McCanns built a wall of denial. To maintain it, they had to cast doubt on the very instruments of truth. And so Martin Grime, Eddie and Keela, three figures who had done nothing but their jobs, were pushed under the bus. Looking back now, 18 years later, the injustice is plain. Grime did not accuse. Eddie and Keela did not fabricate. They indicated, calmly and consistently, the presence of cadaver scent and blood in places tied only to one family. Their work should have been treated as the beginning of inquiry, not the end of credibility. Instead, they became the scapegoats, their professionalism rewritten as fallibility. And therein lies the biographical cruelty of this case. The truth was not only denied, the truth-tellers were condemned. Martin Grime, once a respected authority, was forced to defend himself against insinuations he had never deserved. Eddie and Keela, unable to speak, were mocked as unreliable tools. What should have been celebrated as forensic clarity was instead attacked as investigative noise. The result is a lesson in how fragile truth can be when it collides with power, money, and reputation. The dogs did their job. The handler did his duty. But in the theater of public opinion, orchestrated by a pair of desperate parents, their voices were turned against them. The tragedy of Praia da Luz is not only that a child vanished. It is that those who uncovered the closest thing to evidence were treated as if they were the ones in the wrong. When official investigations into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann slowed into stalemate, the debate did not fade. It migrated online, where thousands of ordinary people dissected every report, every contradiction, and every piece of forensic evidence. In these digital spaces, the voices of Eddie and Keela, the two dogs whose alerts had been dismissed by the parents, were resurrected as symbols of truth. On Twitter, users condensed years of investigative files into sharp statements that cut through confusion. Posts highlighted the same recurring points: the 17 separate alerts from the dogs, the 15 out of 19 DNA markers recovered from the boot of the McCann's Renault Scenic, and the 48 unanswered police questions that Kate McCann refused to address. Instead of narrative speculation, these short bursts of information hammered on the clarity of numbers. To scrolling audiences, the case was no longer about shifting theories of abduction. It was about unignorable statistics. Threads circulated reminding readers that the dogs had alerted in only one direction, toward McCann belongings and spaces, and had been silent everywhere else. Infographics summarized the pattern: sofa, wardrobe, clothing, toy, car. The more these posts spread, the more they hardened into a collective memory. Whatever excuses were offered, the biological trail uncovered in 2007 could not be erased. Reddit provided a slower, more expansive forum for debate. Long posts walked new readers through the official Portuguese files, pointing out that Eddie had alerted behind the sofa in apartment 5A, and Keela had confirmed blood at the same spot. Commenters argued that cadaver scent does not transfer randomly, that dogs do not bark at toys or car keys without cause. In some discussions, defenders of the McCanns tried to argue contamination or false positives, but their positions were usually dismantled by other users who pointed to the dog's record of reliability, the corroborating DNA results, and the absence of alerts anywhere else in Praia da Luz. The collective mood across these communities was blunt. Denial equals cover-up. When representatives of the family suggested that the smell in the car could have come from diapers, spoiled food, or trash, online audiences laughed. Posts ridiculed the idea that only the McCanns' rubbish had the same chemical signature as human decomposition. To them, the explanations were not defenses, but confirmations that the truth was being hidden. Still, there was a minority willing to defend the McCanns. They pointed out that no court had ever convicted them, that a full DNA match had never been secured, and that British investigators continued to frame the case as abduction. For a time, these views gained traction, reminding others that suspicion is not the same as proof. But in the open marketplace of digital debate, such defenses rarely held. Commenters replied with the same relentless refrain: the dogs had never lied, and their alerts were captured on video for the world to see. What made these online discussions powerful was not just the information, but the persistence. Year after year, as media attention waned, online communities kept returning to the same evidence. Every time new funding was announced for official inquiries, posts resurfaced about the ignored dog alerts. Every time the McCanns gave interviews, threads revived the contradictions in their statements. The internet became a living archive, ensuring that the barks and signals recorded in 2007 would never disappear into silence. The cumulative effect was striking. Even without courtroom convictions, public consensus hardened. In the eyes of many who followed the case online, the dogs had spoken the closest thing to truth the investigation ever uncovered. Their alerts became more trustworthy than the words of parents who shifted their stories, more trustworthy than officials who closed files for lack of conclusive evidence. The dogs were impartial. The dogs were consistent. The dogs, unlike anyone else, could not be accused of having an agenda. 18 years after Madeleine's disappearance, the same discussions still appear online. Posts continue to remind new audiences about the 17 alerts, the partial DNA profile, the unanswered questions. Skeptics continue to mock the explanations offered by the McCanns. Supporters continue to defend the couple, but their numbers are thin compared to the chorus of suspicion. And through it all, one refrain echoes again and again: dogs don't lie, blood doesn't lie, denial does. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is not only a story of a child who vanished, it is also a story of how truth can be spoken and then silenced. For a brief window in the summer of 2007, two dogs uncovered signals that should have reshaped the entire investigation. Yet, because of legal technicalities, political pressures, and parental denials, those signals were buried. The case illustrates how evidence can exist in plain sight and still be dismissed, leaving behind a trail of haunting lessons. The first obstacle was legal. In most jurisdictions, dog alerts cannot be used as direct proof in court. The reason lies in procedure. A bark or a point is considered an indicator, not conclusive evidence. Courts demand physical confirmation, DNA, fingerprints, photographs that can withstand adversarial challenge. A cadaver dog might bark behind a sofa, but unless human remains or conclusive biological samples are recovered there, the alert remains legally ambiguous. Critics argue this is common sense. Justice must be based on objective, replicable proof, not the instincts of an animal, no matter how well trained. Supporters of canine evidence, however, point out that Eddie and Keela had a spotless record across more than 200 cases. Still, in the eyes of the law, their reliability was never enough to convict. The consequence was stark. Jerry and Kate McCann avoided legal jeopardy. Despite cadaver scent on Kate's clothing, despite alerts on Cuddle Cat, despite blood in the Renault Scenic, the couple remained shielded. Portuguese prosecutors admitted the evidence was troubling, but lacked sufficient corroboration. British authorities, under Operation Grange, chose to ignore the alerts altogether, framing the case strictly as an abduction. In a courtroom sense, the denials worked. The McCanns could stand before cameras and insist there was no evidence against them. Technically, they were right. But the court of public opinion delivered a different verdict. Online discussions, documentaries, and books kept returning to the same facts: 17 alerts, 15 DNA markers, 48 unanswered questions. To millions who followed the case, the denials looked less like reason and more like avoidance. In living rooms, on forums, and across social media, suspicion clung to the McCanns in ways that no PR campaign could wash away. They had escaped legal judgment, but they could not escape the gaze of the public, which saw in every dismissal a hint of guilt. From this paradox arise several lessons. Lesson 1: truth can be denied, but it cannot be erased. The McCanns may have mocked the dogs, questioned their reliability, and offered alternative explanations involving diapers or spoiled meat. But the alerts remain, preserved in official police files and replayed endlessly in online archives. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, the videos of Eddie barking behind the sofa or reacting to the car boot circulate as fresh evidence to new audiences. Denial delayed recognition, but it did not destroy memory. The truth survives, even when ignored. Lesson 2: legal justice and public justice are not the same. Courts are bound by strict evidentiary rules. Public opinion is not. While judges demand DNA profiles and chain of custody, ordinary people respond to patterns, consistency, and common sense. To the law, Eddie's bark was inadmissible. To the public, it was irrefutable. This gap explains the enduring frustration around the case. Officially, there was insufficient evidence. Socially, there was overwhelming evidence. Between these two realms lies the chasm where Madeleine's story remains unresolved. Lesson 3: lies can protect in the short term, but history remembers the truth. In 2007 and 2008, the McCanns' denials insulated them from prosecution. They wrote books, hired lawyers, and maintained their narrative of abduction. But as years passed, those denials hardened into a legacy of suspicion. Each mocking phrase, "ask the dogs," or 2 + 2 = 10, became not defenses but markers of deflection. Generations now grow up reading these words as evidence not of innocence but of evasion. What once served as a shield now reads as a confession. The lesson is simple: deception may protect for a moment, but time has a way of amplifying suppressed truths. This case also carries a broader warning about power. Institutions, governments, police forces, media organizations can close ranks around a narrative. They can dismiss inconvenient findings, silence dissenting voices, and redirect public attention. But the persistence of truth-tellers, even silent ones, ensures that denial can never be absolute. Eddie and Keela had no voices. Their barks and points were mediated only through their handler. Yet those signals resonated more powerfully than the words of ministers or spin doctors. They endured because they were simple, consistent, and incorruptible. And so the story circles back to the two dogs and their handler. Martin Grime did not accuse anyone, he simply recorded what his dogs indicated. Eddie barked. Keela pointed. Their alerts were not conclusions but clues. The fact that those clues were never pursued does not diminish their weight. It magnifies the tragedy. Here were two instruments of truth, operating without agenda, and yet their testimony was buried under ridicule and dismissal. The final image is haunting. Eddie, nose pressed to the boot of a car, barking. Keela, frozen at the spot where blood once spilled. Grime, clipboard in hand, noting the alerts with professional restraint. Around them, cameras rolled, journalists speculated, and parents denied. Years later, the scene remains frozen in memory: 3 silent witnesses, 2 canine, 1 human, standing on the side of truth, drowned out by the louder machinery of denial. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains unsolved, but the lessons are enduring. Truth may be ignored by courts, mocked by parents, and sidelined by politicians. but it survives in the files, in the footage, and in the collective conscience of the public. Justice is not only the verdict of a judge, it is also the memory of a community. And in that memory, Eddie and Keela endure, not as unreliable tools, but as silent witnesses to a truth the world was never willing to face.